Hey, this is Steve in Dallas, Texas. It's Saturday morning, my friend, and you are listening to Light Talk.
And this is Zach coming to you from Washington, D.C. You are listening to Light Talk, and we are the Lumen Brothers. Welcome, everyone, to episode 249. Today, we are chatting with Jeromy Hopgood. Hello. All right, so Jeromy is a Detroit-based designer for live entertainment, working primarily in scenic, lighting, and projection design. In addition to his freelance work, he is also a tenured professor at Eastern Michigan University, where he founded the Multidisciplinary Entertainment Design and Technology program, one of the only of its kind in the country. He is also the author of various design and technology books, including QLab 3, Show Control, Dance Production, QLab 4, Projects in Video, Audio, and Show Control, and his latest book, which just came out last month, The Projection Designer's Toolkit, all through Routledge Press. Select design credits include People's Light in Philadelphia, Williamstown Theater, Detroit Public Theater, Michigan Shakespeare Festival, Tipping Point Theater, Lexington Shakespeare Festival, and the Williamstown Theater Festival during its Tony Award-winning season. His projection design for Dominique Morisseau's Skeleton Crew at People's Light and Theater Company was nominated for a 2018 Barrymore Award for Excellence in Professional Philadelphia Theater for Outstanding Media Design. Thanks for joining us today, Jeromy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here with you.
Excellent. So we'll just jump right in. We all love a good origin story. You have such a diverse, multidisciplinary background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started in our industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Most common stories that come from the entertainment industry, this one starts in a little state called Arkansas, which is kind of out of the blue. Often that's kind of a starting point for me because, growing up as a kid in Arkansas, I was involved a lot in the arts, but not in theater. I did a lot of music. I did a lot of graphic arts, things like that. But primarily, I did a lot of writing. And I ended up going to undergrad when I first started out, thinking I was going to get a BFA in creative writing. And I was about 35 hours or so away from graduating when I stumbled across theatrical design. And it was this kind of, this kismet that you come across, and it's just like, oh, hey, these are all of the things that I like to do bundled up into this one little package. And of course, in the small theater program that I was affiliated with there at Arkansas Tech University, it was a very, very small program. And so everybody kind of did everything at that time. So I spent a lot of time doing things like sound design and scenic design. I ended up going to graduate school to get my MFA in scenic design. But my secondary emphasis while I was in graduate school was in lighting design. And really, I think a lot of that has always just come back to this idea that I'm one of those kind of people that it's very difficult for me to say no to something that I like doing. And for a long time, whether it was for financial reasons or just right place, right time, I was really lucky to be able to jump around between a lot of different worlds. And then along the way, I did discover projection design, which was a big sort of revelatory moment for me when I figured out that there was this medium that I could work in that really did pull together a lot of the sort of the graphic design side of things, and sound side of things, and the timing and all of that. And from that point on, I've really spent most of my time over the last 10 years or so focusing primarily on scenery and projection, because those are the opportunities that have come around the most these days.
Do you enjoy doing multiple designs on the same show?
I really do. It depends on which I'm doing for the show, though, as to how much I enjoy that process. I really do enjoy doing scenery and projection together, because it's a lot about when you do the work. I mean, as a scenic designer, so much of that work is very front loaded. And typically by the time I'm getting into a tech situation, so much of the problem solving and the heavy lifting's already been done, which of course is the time when you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting as the projection designer. So if I know going into it that I can do both, the good side of that is, and the bad side is, you've got no one to blame but yourself. Because you get into that sort of a situation often as a projection designer, and you're having to request certain things of the scenic designer so that everybody can see things better, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And as the scenic designer, sometimes you're working with a projection designer and they're wanting to get something out of it. And you're like, oh man, I hate to sacrifice this. But of course, we do it for the best of the production. But when you're doing both of those, it's sort of best and worst case scenario, because you get to convince yourself of those kind of choices you need to make. But at the same time, you are ultimately the one responsible for both of those if they end up being a screw up.
Have you gone all in and done scenery, lighting, and projection on a show?
I have not. I've done projection and lighting on the same show. And honestly, that was without having a full range of assistance on both areas. I would never do that again because of just the amount of focus that is taken in terms of the timing of things and being able to have enough eyes looking at the right thing at the right time. I sort of feel like that becomes difficult for me.
Sure. Do you find that you approach projects differently as a multidisciplinary designer? So let's say you're just doing the projections or the scenery for a show, but because your background is in all these different disciplines, do you find that you approach just doing one of them differently than you think somebody who only does that might approach it?
I'm not sure if there's a difference to it, but I think there's an awareness that allows you to sometimes anticipate things that other people might not think of at the same time, because you've been down that road and you've done certain things. And I do think it's difficult because as a person, I'm someone who I'm a talker. I like to chat up things, right? And sometimes it's difficult to know when that bit of advice is welcome and useful and when it becomes a distraction to the conversation of what's going on. So I definitely think these days I feel much more confident in those kind of settings. Early on in my career, there were probably some instances where I was a little bit too willing to share my advice with other people, and and we learned that along the way, and I think that's a lot of sort of how we collaborate with people. But yeah, definitely, I think I do enjoy being able to throw some problem solving ideas off of people if it's not in an area that I'm necessarily working on, and it's welcome, and we're all sort of butting our heads against a wall, figuring out what's going on. It's like, well, a couple of years ago, I did something that's similar to this. it might help you, it might not. Take it for what it's worth.
Sure.
Well, was that kind of in the back of your head, this mentoring and sharing advice that led you into education?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely one of those people that likes to talk a lot about the whys of things. And I question the whys of things a lot. I understand it's this way. Why is that? It's much more interesting to me to think about why something is rather than just what it is. Um, and and yeah, I think before I started teaching, I was definitely that kind of a person who liked to talk about things and sort of figure out the heart of a problem or maybe work through a solution. And I think most designers are like that. Frankly, I I often find that designers make really good teachers for that reason, because we're natural problem solvers. And teaching often has that at its heart, where you're trying to figure out um, what's the best way to the root of a solution. And that kind of thinking comes so naturally to designers.
Can you tell us a little bit about the program there at Eastern Michigan University?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I came to Eastern Michigan in 2008, which was a terrifying time to move across the country. I had previously been teaching in North Carolina, and I relocated to the Detroit area to teach at Eastern Michigan. And that was right when the bottom was falling out of the global economy. Um, at that time, there was a gentleman who has since retired from our program, but he had been around for a long time and was very much so invested in the film industry in our state. And around that time, we had quite a bit of film incentives that were going on in Michigan, and we were seeing a lot of production that was happening. And the industry was very much so speaking to this idea that the state at the time couldn't really support the infrastructure of making as many movies as people would like, because there wasn't enough trained personnel. Um, and so at that time, the idea was to try to create some kind of a new program in design that was situated in the theater area of things, but it was going to be a design program that focused on things that were outside of the scope of a traditional theatrical design degree. And we talked about this early. Part of me taking the job was this excitement of trying to create something that was unique and that dealt with things that that a lot of us understand in the industry, and maybe it doesn't make its way back into the education world so much, which is, most theatrical designers, when they're getting a paycheck, often it's not coming from the theater world necessarily. And so then there you are in the profession and trying to figure out the inner workings of, okay, well, how's opera a little bit different? How's it different to be working in dance or in this sector, right? And so what we wanted to do was to try to create a program that just sort of acknowledged that from the beginning. So there's a core of theatrical design classes that students take, but then there is a whole list of minors that they can take in conjunction with it. And then also a series of cognate electives and other artistic programs and design and engineering programs around campus, so that they can make this a la carte kind of program. So say someone came in and they wanted to be a sound designer, they might be focusing their theatrical studies in our area, perhaps getting a minor in music, and then taking a series of cognate electives in a digital media production side of things, where they're focusing more on sound editing and things like that. So
That's excellent.
yeah, it's a real opportunity for people to come in and say to me as a teacher, this is what I want to do with my career. And then we can say, all right, well, what can we put together to help you best be served?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds really interesting because I think a lot of what people can get out of a program like that is, it's one thing to have a program, again, using the example of like sound design in theatrical sound design, and everything is kind of focused on that particular thing. And one of the things that sounds like you're doing, which is really neat, is you're saying all these other things have little bits and pieces that will be useful for sound design. And then there's other little bits and pieces in these courses as well that, might expand your view of what you're going to be working on. And maybe you'll also pick up a little bit of, experience in something that's related to sound design, but is not primarily sound design. So I think that's really great. So you also are a published author, as we have mentioned before. So how did that come into your life? It's interesting, just like as your career grows and you just keep adding more things to your workload.
Yeah, it is kind of funny, those moments when you take on a new project and you're so excited about it, and you come home and you're talking to my wife is a theatrical sound designer too, so we juggle a lot of this, and we come home and there's that excitement, and then you're like, all right, and where's the time for this? Well, we'll make it, it'll be great. Right. So for me, like a lot of things in my career, the writing was something that I've always been interested in. Like I said, I had a background in creative writing and spent a lot of time doing that. And I sort of thought that was just a part of my life it was a chapter that was gone. And when I had my first teaching job, straight out of grad school, I was working at the University of Kentucky. And there's another faculty member there, John Holloway, who he has done a series of books through Routledge over the years called the Illustrated Theater Production Guide. And he and I had some conversations about it. And it was one of those kind of things where you start talking about things and you realize, oh, I do have an interest in that. And so some years later, I had some communications with the acquisitions editor over at Routledge, and talked just about different possibilities. And this was just at the time that QLab 2 was out, and 3 would be coming out in the near future. And I had been thinking, I'd been approached by a lot of people over the years about some kind of a book for QLab, just because I had taught it from its inception. And everyone was always like, well, where's the manual? And at that time, there wasn't really a manual. And I taught a lot of classes on it. And one day someone said that, and I was like, yeah, there isn't one. And they're like, well, someone should write one of those. And I thought, yeah, someone really should. And so I got in touch with Chris Ashworth at Figure 53, and talked to him a little bit about it. And he was like, well, we're doing the beta testing for QLab 3 right now. What if you beta test it as you're writing the book? You can sort of see how this is being developed. And at that time, Figure 53 and some of the staff there were actually serving as a technical editor for me on that book.
That's cool.
So yeah, it was a really nice opportunity to be able to work closely with the software development side of that. Although, I wasn't personally involved with it, but other than on the beta side of that, right? And so sort of seeing these changes along the way. After the QLab 3 book came out, and I started doing a little bit more sort of instructional work at LDI and things like that, it was kind of a one thing leads to another process. I had done a lot of dance design over the years, and there was a few choreographers I had worked with who remarked that my process was a little bit different than other lighting designers that they had worked with. And we sort of talked about why that was. And, I had had some dance classes coming up and music. And I think it was just a little bit of a different approach. And it was that kind of conversation again of, well, maybe that would be worth putting your thoughts down on sort of how we collaborate. And so that book became this conversation of how can designers think a little bit more like choreographers, and how can choreographers think a little bit more like designers, and we can all work together a little better. So yeah, that's it. It's always sort of that interesting right place, right time, aha moments.
Well, you can't stop there. You've got to talk now about your latest book.
Yeah, sure. So the latest book, The Projection Designer's Toolkit, this is one that I've been so excited about for a while. Routledge has this fantastic series that all your listeners should run out and grab, the Toolkit series. And I know that like the Assistant Lighting Designer's Toolkit that Anne has done, and a number of them, they are fantastic industry desk reference kind of materials. And I had known for a while that I wanted to do a toolkit series. And Stacy, the acquisitions editor at Routledge, had talked to me about doing a projection book. And a few other friends had recently done some fantastic books on projection and media design. Dave and Gaddy, and Daniel Fine and Alex Olszewski. And I knew at the time that I wanted to get a new book out on projection design, but I felt like it needed to have something that was a little bit unique to it. So for this book, I got in touch with a lot of different designers from the field to try to get some interviews as case studies for how things are working in the industry right now. Because projection design changes so quickly. And we're also, for the fact that we've been around for a while, we're still very much so an evolving field that doesn't have.
Right. We're still the
yeah,
new kid.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're right now kind of where sound was in the early 90s in a lot of ways of creating standards and sort of thinking of how we're going to address things as a collective. But you know, there's so many different ways to do what it is that we do. Even as a union, we haven't truly decided on how we're going to codify all of this. So for me, I wanted this book to be my thoughts on the process of being a projection designer, very much so rooted in my personal process. But then a whole series of interviews where we could talk to people who are working at all levels. So, I mean, people like Wendell Harrington and Peter Negrini, Jeff Sugg, Broadway designers like Zach, also some younger designers and people who are approaching it in a very different way. Rayshawn Devante Johnson, David Bengali, Chet Miller, talked to some programmers, had an interview with Paul Vershbow to talk about the idea of how programming is essential to the process, and talk to Christine Franzen about the process of being an assistant. So we really wanted it to be something that was giving people a lot of different perspectives. Just because I think more so than almost any of our other design fields, in projection design, it's really hard to paint this square on the floor and say, everything lives inside this box. So it's exciting for me to kind of look at what's happening in the world right now of projection design. And then it leaves us some opportunities to come back later and say, hey, look where we are now. And some of these things have stuck and some things have evolved. And here's where we are then.
As you're gathering and collecting all these stories about everybody's different process, did you find that there was any kind of common themes, or was it surprisingly varied, or did you find anything that kind of the thread that tied it all together?
I don't know if there's any one thread that tied it all together. I do think that it's sort of interesting to see the ways the ways that people use assistant designers and associates, I think that is a particularly interesting thing because, as you guys know, I'm sure, like, most of our projection designers working out there are probably not working at a position that is affording them the opportunity to be working with assistants and associates always,
Right.
even though we all know that we should. So I guess if I'm going to be honest about the common thread that came through everything, it was this understanding of this idea that you should always advocate for the best case scenario that you feel like you should have. Like, you should always advocate for the kind of media server you want to be working from, and a system engineer if you can get it, and a programmer if you can get it, an assistant associate if you can get it, because that's on parity with, at least in a union world, our other design disciplines. And if we can all keep saying this and enough producers are hearing it, then it will become an expectation, right? But I think also, if we're being honest, everyone also contributed this idea that we're not there yet. And even though, like, this is what you should strive for, you should also have a realistic understanding of, if not this, then this. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see what people's priorities are, and sort of how they change from project to project. But yeah, I mean, I think across the board, everybody was very vocal about our need to be advocates and teachers, and that we have to educate everyone about our discipline and just keep doing that so that it's just sort of understood.
Right. Sometimes every time.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes every single time.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations, especially with people like Peter Negrini, where part of the challenge that we have, maybe more so than some of the other disciplines in theater business in particular, is that part of the process, what goes into making or the fabrication of the projections, requires a skill set where that some people who do things like 3D modeling and motion graphics and animation, that, like, what they get paid in theater compared to what they might get paid in, like, a TV commercial, makes them not really want to work in theater.
Absolutely.
Unless you find someone who just has an immense passion for creating motion graphics for theater. But the flip side of that, which I've always found very interesting too, is, like, for instance, I'm working on a project right now where there's a lot of big corporations involved. And so big corporations assume that problems can only be solved by other big corporations or large groups of people. And I kind of looked at this one projection mapping thing they wanted to do, and I was like, me and a good assistant could figure this out in like a 3-hour work call. We don't need 25 guys and a laser scanner to do this. Because that's the creature of theater kind of mentality, is like, we only have 3 hours and we're going to get to look at it once, so we better know how to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's very interesting that when I started my career 20 years ago, we were the new kid and we're still the new kid. I guess I don't know what else there is to add. Maybe some kind of special effects thing. In your process of interviewing, did you collect some information about the collaborative process? Did people talk about, how they collaborate with the other designers in the room? Things that we could pass along to, let's say, students who are learning how to collaborate. That's always something. You're not, when you're a student in college, hopefully you're not just learning how to design, but you're also learning how to collaborate with the other designers.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interviews did provide a lot of information for that. And then in the chapters, that was a big thing that I really wanted to focus on. So particularly in the process, the book's kind of broken down into sections, and one of the sections is a a design and production workflow. And it kind of takes you through the beginning. It takes you through the entirety of the process from beginning to end, right? And there is a series of questions in there for collaborating with other designers in the production team. And for most of those, they include a series of questions to be able to ask too. So I often feel like that's really probably one of the best ways that we can collaborate is by asking rather than telling things. I can tell you all of the things that I have in mind for this one particular moment and all of the looks and the inspiration that it's coming from. But if I ask the right question, I can learn right off the bat whether I actually need to spend the time telling you about that. Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, there are a series of questions in there. One of the things about the interviews that I thought that worked really well, though, was I was able to get a lot of people from a lot of different stylistic approaches. So like when I was speaking with Tal Yarden, we talked a lot about his approach to doing the live cinema, kind of having lots of live cameras going on, because that is a completely different beast from your traditional playback. And just talking through that idea of how, okay, if you're doing this kind of a choice, then suddenly now that domino effect has set in and you need to think about this, and this. And speaking to people like Matt Reagan about Touch Designer and the idea of like, how do you go about the process of maybe even creating your own media server for a project that you're working on because what you have doesn't necessarily meet the needs of this one particular thing. So yeah, and in that side of things, sort of getting back to your idea of that corporate talk and the software world, Matt does a lot of this kind of work that is involved with a lot of larger corporations and sort of big name projects. And that does bring the synergy of engineers and programmers and artists together. And it was very interesting when I asked him, as I asked a lot of the designers, what do you like to be called? Are you a projection designer? Are you a media designer? Are you a digital media designer? Because we, as an industry, we still also haven't really settled 100% on what we want to call ourselves. And he said an interesting sort of thing is, I actually want to be fluid, because sometimes when I'm in a conversation with a software engineer, I'm going to refer to myself as this because they're not going to make certain assumptions about me. And sometimes when I'm in this meeting, I may refer to myself as this because they will make certain assumptions about me. And I thought that was very interesting to kind of have that consideration of,
yeah, definitely.
Collaboration is what people is a little bit about the assumptions people make about you too, and your job.
Yeah. And do you find that with this book and maybe in any of your previous ones, that as you start to collect all this information and assemble it into this kind of structure, that it influences or changes the way you operate as a designer?
Oh, absolutely. I've got to say, and I think because you participated in a number of these conversations over the course of the pandemic, where I might reach out and just say, hey, as a designer who hasn't worked a Broadway show before, what is this like? Because I know it's a little bit different. And we had lots of fun little texts back and forth kind of conversation. And I had so many of these fantastic moments at a time when, it was a hard time for all of us. And the entertainment industry was shut down. And we were all just looking for any number of outlets to fill that gaping hole of being in shows at that time, right? And it was fantastic for me to be able to have access. Frankly, I know that I had access to a lot of designers that probably would not have had time during a normal year because they would have been too busy.
That's a good point.
And so we had a lot of conversations that absolutely, it informed the way that I design, and also the way that I'm teaching my students too. Because there's certain things that, you just pick up along the way, and someone says, well, I do this. And you're like, oh,
Right.
of course. I mean, I never would have thought of that, but you say it and it's like, oh, right. That's a no-brainer. So yeah, I don't think you can go through the process of teaching something without learning. And putting together these books is definitely, for me, it's always been about the teaching side of it, for sure.
That's excellent.
Let's go back to that teaching side just for a second. I mean, other than the books that you're creating, what are you recommending for your students to read? What should they be exploring on campus as far as these other classes they should be taking? What kind of internship should they be looking at if they want to be a media designer?
The fun thing about that is, I think it gets to be so individualized for what that particular student wants to do. But if we're talking about media projection design in specific, I really want to get them into some classes that get them thinking about the camera as an eye, and thinking about composition and basic artistic things that aren't all. We talk about design, composition, things like that in our theatrical classes, but there's so many different models that we can use out there to learn about. By the time I took my theater design classes, a lot of those concepts were already drilled into my head from things like, figure drawing, and taking classes on printmaking, things like that. So I'm always looking for ways to get the student thinking about something in a different way. Also, I'm really pushing this notion that if you are already paying to be, and this is for my university students, but they're already paying to be in school, and they can take advantage of so many resources that I never had access to through online resources through our libraries and things like that. So I definitely look at a wide range of books that are coming from our design and technology side of things that maybe they wouldn't have bought for themselves. And I'm like, just get out there and take a look at that book that's on editing in Logic. Spend an hour looking it over, see what kind of tricks you can learn. And then the opposite end of that spectrum is really, YouTube is amazing for the number of things that students can learn from. And they're constantly teaching me, because I'm going through talking about, okay, this process in Illustrator. And they're like, oh yeah, I learned how to do this really quickly in this 10-minute video. And you're like, that's a little demoralizing, but okay, can you send that my way? So yeah, but definitely the classics, we want to make sure that they are reading their Peter Brook. We want to make sure that they are looking at those classic Melziner designs and talking about the plays that they came from. One thing I will say is that, particularly if you want to be a designer that's working in theater, the most important thing I think that you can do is learn to be an excellent dramaturg. And somebody who can find the dramaturgical meaning in the text that you're looking at, but also somebody who is really spending some time thinking about the ways that the story is being communicated, right? So I do talk a lot about just dramatic structure and this idea of how do how do we suss out the meaning of the story? Because at the end of the day, that's what you have to say as a designer, right? You've got to figure out those 2 or 3 most important pearls of wisdom from the script. And then you figure out, all right, how will my projection design do this without using words? Or sometimes we get to use words. Actually, we do get to cheat a little bit.
Right.
I say that in other disciplines, and it's like, yeah, the playwright gets all these words, and we have to say them just with images. But sometimes we get lucky and we can use text and
Right.
audio too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know the big new thing, or I guess it's not so new anymore, but the thing that a lot of people are talking about now is this idea of immersive theater, and how projections are sort of on the cutting edge of what makes theater immersive. And I actually was having a discussion earlier today with a bunch of Disney Imagineers about this idea of what makes it immersive, and one of the things they often bring up is like that traveling Van Gogh exhibit. And I said, in my opinion, like, very much tied to what you're saying about the dramaturgical connection there, is that it's one thing to like be in a room with really cool imagery projected all around you, but if you are not connected to that story or have a relationship with that story, then it's not really immersive in an emotional way, at least. It's just you're physically inside a box, so you're trapped almost. And I think what I ended up saying to these guys was that, great theater is a dark ride where the seats don't move. That's how it works.
I love that.
So, but what's really interesting for me is it sounds like with the program that you have that, whatever immersive theater is or is becoming is going to be coming from students like that who are not just trying to, put on the next Les Mis or waiting for Godot. They're trying to find new ways to tell stories and connect with audiences using technology, new and old.
I have a student who recently graduated from our program who came in. Her family actually runs a haunted attraction year round. And it's an elaborate setup that's I think it's basically the size of an old, like a roller rink, that is a fully immersive scenario. And they do beautiful work every year. And she came in very specifically to our program because she was like, I want to learn more of the skills of what we do for live performance to be able to bring back to that. And has done that. And it's fantastic to see when the idea actually works. Because a lot of people do talk about being multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. And at the end of the day, often I think it's hard for people, particularly in academia. I will say, in university settings, people have their silos and they often just paths don't cross well. So that idea of being able to make sure that we can all get in the same sandbox and play, or at least that your sandbox is open for other people to hop into occasionally, that's important.
So for people who are interested in a program like yours, what kind of knowledge or expectations do you have of them prior to coming into your program? Before you bake the bread, what kind of ingredients do you like to see in it first?
I think there's a lot of different possibilities there. I don't think there is any one magic formula for, yes, you are the perfect student. What I like to see, frankly, is someone who is excited about the idea of making things. It doesn't have to be theater. You don't have to have any theatrical background to be accepted into our program. You could be coming from any number of worlds, but what you need to be is somebody who can articulate this idea of how you would like to be involved in the process of art making. can you communicate with me as a peer? That's a big one. I will say, a lot of students coming out of high school these days, I do feel like, for whatever reason, there isn't always a willingness to communicate. I think I would say for a lot of students coming out of high school that communication is different these days than it was when I was coming out of school, certainly. And that's to be expected in a lot of different ways. But for me, a designer, first and foremost, is always a communicator. And very close second is a problem solver. So our job is always communication. And I feel like whether you have the design skills or not, there's a lot that can be learned from having a conversation with someone about their goals and expectations, what they want to get out of the program. And that doesn't mean that students have to have a clear idea coming in 100% of what they would like. I'm very proud to say that we are a very open program. I have a lot of students who come from first generation college families, who come from non-traditional backgrounds. And I think that that's a big part of what I want to see in our program, is that we are getting people who want us, right? I want someone who has a great idea of what they can get out of the program. That gets me really excited. But even if you're just excited about learning something new,
that's great.
Do you think this is the communication is a problem of our own making? I mean, if we look back a little bit, we have forgotten how to write a letter because we don't use that anymore. And
Sure.
we have, as teachers, I don't think high school students learn this by themselves. We have taught them to communicate in the briefest of form. Send me a 5-word text. Don't make it 10 words. Make it a very short email. We're taking this. We're making things non-personal, and that's a difficulty if you're an artist trying to work with other people. If I'm a novelist, I guess I can sit there by myself in my study and write a book. But if I'm trying to create something with other people, I have to be able to communicate with them. And I have to be able to, kind of where you started the whole conversation a few minutes ago, learn to listen.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And why don't you, before we wrap it up, tell us, where can we find your books? Plug away.
You can find the books at any fine booksellers. You can find it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or at the Routledge website itself. If you're looking for more information on the Projection Designers Toolkit, and you're on Facebook, just pop by and look at PJ Toolkit. And that should take you to the page for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. Well, the rocking sounds of the Luminoids tells us that once again you've spent another morning listening to Light Talk. You can hear our show on Spotify, iTunes, Google, YouTube, livedesignonline.com, Amazon Prime Music, and just about every podcast site out there. Check out our website at lighttalk.org for future guests, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our podcast. That way, you will not miss a second of Light Talk insanity.
No guarantee is offered regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast. However,
if you do decide to litigate, the law firm of Flecht, Flocht, Flair, and Glare and their paralegal Snoot will defend us until our retirement funds are depleted.
Light Talk is written and produced by the Lumen Brothers, coming to you from Washington, D.C., Detroit, and the Lone Star State.
And be sure to join us next week when we chat about more useless things and explore the crazy shenanigans of our industry.
Light Talk, broadcasting questionable Lumen knowledge and humor around the world.
We will see you all next Saturday morning. Bye-bye from Light Talk.
Lumen.